introduction. I really appreciate it. I want to give a special thank you to Doctors Kelly Dietz and Gordon Steffi, who are in here somewhere, for reaching out and inviting me to be a part of such an important program that can only be described as restorative justice and reparations. I would also like to thank the descendant community for allowing me to be a part of the African American Cemetery Symposium. I do not take this lightly. I'd like to give another special thanks to Matthew Torres, who is a program coordinator who coordinated our travel, our housing, similar to Dr. Jackson. We got here late to this space can be something. And so we made sure that we were there and all checked in and really appreciate it. And I keep saying they, because I want to also thank my oldest two sons, Javen and Zaire, shout out to them back, who have accompanied me this weekend. It really, truly is an honor to be here on ground made sacred by our ancestors, who navigated the impossible slaveocracy, fought hard for freedom, who rejected dehumanization of slavery, and they refused to be forgotten. Their burial, the last material culture of their own creation, is how we remember, is how we memorialize them. And so the time that we have today, I really want to talk with you about the topic that is the title slide here. African American burial grounds as social justice activism. We'll come back to these images a little bit later in my presentation, but just getting you to think about that connection. African American burial spaces, the places and spaces that Black folks are buried in social justice activism. When George Floyd was murdered, Connor Wright and Anna Baker, University of Penn graduate students in the art department, wanted to do something. If you read reports of this makeshift cemetery that was in Minneapolis about a month after his murder, they wanted to do something involving naming. And they came up with creating a makeshift cemetery. So think about the power in that. In naming, and that's all they really knew, name, maybe birth date, death date, but that name. So there's real power in that as we start really thinking about that. All right. So in continuing to get you to think about this idea of African American cemeteries and social activism, I really want to center my own research. That starts with deathways, and y'all see I'm walking, so let me know if you can still hear me. Really centers on deathways, the ways in which Black folks are dying, right? And I want to start with this quote by Maurice Jackson, who says, "All people die, but do not all people die alike." Right there, we're talking about the systemic oppression, right? When we're one step away from death being a social justice issue when we ask that. I am one of a few women who started the Collective for Radical Death Studies. And when you talk about folks who are either death doulas or death practitioners, or folks who are involved in this work, people love to say this phrase, well, death is the great equalizer. So there's a real, as we've been talking about, comfort in talking about death because we all die, but we do not all die alike. COVID taught us that, folks in the present, and I think we need to really think about this. So for at least 10 years, I have been studying Baltimore's Mount Auburn Cemetery. The oldest autonomous, Black-owned cemetery in Baltimore, goes back to 1807. I'll spend some time definitely talking about that. And in my research suggests the oldest autonomous Black-owned burial space in the state. And I started with the question of, so these are really America's oldest Methodist folks, not AME. They were tethered to the Methodists, right? Strawbridge and them, that came from Europe. And they petitioned for their own space. They petitioned for their own burial ground, even though they could have been buried at Lovely Lane. And this church, Sharp Street Church, that still owns this cemetery, it's a very powerful act in that owning, as we're talking about. They built a brick and mortar church around 1802. 5 years later, they spend money, raise money, which to today's standards accounts to about $15,000 to buy what is a 2 1/4 acre of land for their cemetery. And I thought, why? There's something going on here other than having a space of resting in peace. And my research suggests that this was about fighting back, using the burial ground to fight back against slavery. Later on, fight back against Jim Crow. Later on, fighting back against this dehumanization. So I want to invite you all to really think about death, the ways in which we're dying, as a lens to understand the early African American experience in America. In the 19th century, African American burial rights. So this is really about the right of burial, not R-I-T-E-S, but this idea of I can be buried where I want and how I want. So there's a real activist element here, right? And I've talked with you about the autonomous burial ground, how important that is to ownership, how important that is to the issue of social justice. But there's also a land element here, owning land, and we've all talked about it, from Dr. Blakey to Dr. Jackson, owning that land. That was one of the American dream story, if we're using this term anachronistically during this time period. The way to vote, the way to do anything, white land owning male. Y'all are with me, right? So when we think about cemeteries and who's owning the land, all of us are asking this question, right? During this time period, it really is on your personal property where you're buried. So what happens when you can't own the land? These folks decided to do something about it. I think it's very important to really use that and think about these burial rights. So what you're looking at on that left-hand side, that image there, is the historical marker. I think in the 80s, it was a state, on the state registry, and around the 2000s, it is on the National Registry of Historic Places, okay? You probably can't read that, but it says in 1872, and this is in Cherry Hill, South Baltimore, where it stands, and it exists now. But in my research, I found that this went through 4 purposeful phases, again, for fighting for this humanity. First, you had the African burying ground, 1807, 1839. Next, it moved with the ways in which cemeteries were moving during this time period. It's a public health hazard. They're moving them out to the county. It renames it to Villa Burying Ground. Then it comes back to where it is now. And a black community is forming with Hullsville, and I'll write on this. And it's renamed Sharp Street Cemetery after the church that owns it. And in about 1903, it becomes Mount Auburn Cemetery. But again, I want to invite you to look at just what's going on during all of this time. Make sure that doesn't go back. I want to invite you to just think about what's going on during this time period. 1807, the slave trade may have ended, but plantation slavery takes root, right? Some of the most brutal form of dehumanizing and violence that is taking place in the name of white supremacy, in the name of this democracy, right? But establishing African American burial rights creates this idea of freedom through death. And what you're looking at is a deed from 1807. And I encourage you all, and I will continue to say this, find the deed, trace the deeds, find out who is owning this land, and you can continue to do that. Maps are very helpful to find out where these cemeteries have moved around. And I'm gonna read it from here. What it says is that this is a burying ground for the Africans or people of color in the precincts of the city of Baltimore in communion with the Society of Christians and the commonly well known as the Methodist Episcopal Church. In the deed, it goes on to say that when these 7 trustees die, it is going to continue to revert back and be owned by Sharp Street Church. This is very powerful. This is very powerful. Lovely Lane, which is the white church system, is not ever going to have access to this burying ground. It's gonna go to their heirs and assigns, and that's really powerful, especially thinking about what we've been talking about here today. So why? Why have this burying ground and spend all this money? I think we should think about where were black folks buried during this time period. Let me go back. Baltimore is separated in east-west. There was a potter's field in the west, there was a potter's field in the east, and no one wanted to be buried in Potter's Field. And this was not just a space for black folks, but when you look at the city records, you see that upwards to 80 and 90% of the people who are buried in these spaces are racialized black. So that's very important to understand this. And as my bullet points say, this is a burying ground for the unclaimed dead. These folks were buried 4 to a lot in numbered graves, which is not something that should happen in burial. Burials give us humanity. We are named, we are remembered. There's absolutely no legal protection for Potter's Field whatsoever. You'll read accounts where this is before you had regulations of burying 6 feet under, right? A big rain, a big flood comes in, and there's skeletons, there's skulls that are washing around the area. This is a place that in the newspaper you're reading about mischief-making children, not respecting the dead, running around wreaking havoc. So this is definitely not a space where folks are resting in peace. It doesn't matter who you are, but again, I said the majority is black folks there. These grave markers were marked with an old piece of dry goods casing because they hope that the living would come and claim their dead, and that's another reason for the number. The coroner keeping these records. My loved one is missing. Maybe they died, and you come and this is not a place where you're perpetual forever. Right, so I think this is important to think about as well. Commonplace for body snatching, absolutely. If you do not know Dana Ramey Berry and her book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, please know that book, because she talks about the links between the American medical system and the progress of American medicine and how it is absolutely on the backs of black cadavers. Where there's no legality here, and there's evidence that she points to and things I've seen in my own research where you have medical students going out and digging up these bodies because again they're unprotected, and even when there is that conversation with the family, as Dr. Blakey also pointed out, this is white supremacy. This is during slavery. Your voice does not matter. So not being able to rest in peace. And even as he was talking about with the Moody members out of Philadelphia in the 80s and what's going on there. So I think it's important to really think about these burial spaces and having control over it. What does that mean? So Potter's Field was a cemetery for strangers and foreigners. It represented the oppressed life that black folks lived on earth. And this is why they fought like heck to be remembered. One of the things, Rodiger has a really important article, it's an old article, talking about continued legislation in Virginia in the 1600s regarding how black folks could not hold funerals, right? Continued legislation saying black people cannot gather for funerals. Now, one way to read that is, oh my goodness, the policing that's happening to our ancestors. The other way to read that, and it's a very convincing argument, is that they kept doing it. That's why the laws are there. And that's really where my research really fits in there is this is blatant activism in the face of white folks trying to tell me how to remember it or not to be remembered. And you definitely see that in our research here. The other picture is what we commonly call slave cemeteries, where they are in spaces where they look abandoned, they look like they're uncared for. Again, one way to read that is Lynn Rainville, wonderful book, Hidden Histories, in Virginia. You know, she talks about that these are the places and spaces on the plantation that are infertile land. You know, maybe the out of the watchful eye of the slaveholder, or part of these Africanisms, right? These customs brought over that survived the slave trade, where black folks are burying their dead in the woods, next to rivers, next to streams, right? And there's another scholar by the name of Diane Jones that talks about that this is not in disarray. You know, when we think about cemeteries, we have a nice line, you know, headstones, but no, you know, this is them navigating this plantation scape, or this slave scape, you know, as she talks about it, right? Because when you start reading in some of these diaries that these slaveholders, these enslavers have left behind, and how involved some of them were in these funerals, particularly some of the slave mistresses, you will think that that's their kin, how they are trying to lead funeral processions, how they are so mournful. And so you can see how black people want to hide this space from white folks, because you are literally taking over in life and you are literally trying to take over in death. I hope you understand the point, or we can talk about it more. You have slaveholders literally leading funeral processions. So this was a way to really combat a lot of this. Something else to think about is in 1701, this act for the establishment of religious worship, let me go back. As I'm pulling it closer, records were kept, again, this is Maryland, 1701, of everyone who was born, everyone who died, everyone who was married. This is the early iteration of the county courthouse, right? These records that we have now. But the highlighted version, the highlighted that I brought out is, we keep these records of everyone except Negroes and mulattoes. So right there, you see how slavery, you see how white supremacy and whites are having a hold on who gets to be remembered. It's right there in the records for us. And so Sharp Street Church, when you look at their church records during this time period, and the Methodists kept meticulous records, you see that folks' first names, last names, when they were born, when they were died, when they got married, you see all of that coming out in the records. And that's very important. And you will also see language of if someone is no longer involved in the church or they've left the church, you may even see some, a side note of the dealers in the flesh have gotten them. Because Sharp Street is also, it is a church of free and enslaved. And Baltimore is unique like that. By the 1830s, 1840s, the free black population outnumbered the enslaved population, right? So there's some real agency that's going on there. But looking at these records, you can see why burial rights was very important. So continuing on here is just another piece of evidence when you look at who is being buried in Sharp Street's cemetery. Let me see if I'm gonna pull some of these up. These are the interment reports that the city of Baltimore keeps, and this is from, I believe, 1818. It could be 1814. But my point here is that what you see is 105 folks are buried in this year, all right? This is the records from Sharp Street, and you can just count that up. You can eyeball it and see, what is that, maybe 12 people who have died in Sharp Street. That's part of the congregation. So the point, the conclusion to draw here is that this is a burying ground fighting against the dehumanization of slavery, not just for their members, but for Black folks in Baltimore and the surrounding city. Because if 12 people died of their members and 105 people are being buried that year, you can see how this church is really fighting, using burial rights to fight against slavery. And I think that's important to point out. Looking at the next iteration in the phase of it is, this 2 1/4 acre cemetery filled up. This is very common during this time period, all right? And they moved out to the county, like I said, very similar to this modern cemetery movement that is happening, the rural garden cemetery movement that by the 1870s will turn into the lawn garden cemetery movement. But when you look at how this, what they're now calling the Bel Air Burial Ground, is positioning itself, there's some real self-help that's going on and memorial and memory that's happening. And I'll tell you why. So this one here, there we go. So this is a newspaper article, and the part that I've pulled out for you shows you, it shows you, and they're talking about, this is the old Sharp Street Church Cemetery that was also called Spring Garden, Hogg Street, Ridgely Street. I had that mapped out, which is modern day Cherry Hill, which is where it is located now. So it was there, moved, came back. What you have here is the trustees saying, we are disinterring everyone in this cemetery. That's powerful. When you do secondary research and you look at small cemeteries like this, regardless of race, regardless of religion, these cemeteries filled up, and I don't want to say they forgot them, but the common practice was, we're moving on. You saw in the records of people pooling their money, about a year and a half of getting boxes, and again, pooling their money to make sure every person was moved. They remembered their dead. They're not gonna forget them. And when, in a subsequent slides, I'll show this, when it becomes Sharp Street Cemetery, and they buy 8 acres of land, those first acres, A through F, you see oral histories account and written accounts showing that there are enslaved folks buried there. So that's very important to really understand the significance of what this is. Also, benevolent societies and burial societies are very important. This is not unique to Black folks, but as you can imagine with this self-help, no one is coming to make sure that we have what's called a proper burial, because we're not human anyway. And when you're talking about plantations, open air burial was definitely something that was common as well. But by 1820, that's early, there's at least one benevolent and burial society. By 1835, there's between 35 and 40 societies. That is just huge. So again, this is not just Sharp Street taking care of its members. And at this time, it had close to 300 families. So this was a big church, had a lot of significance, and they did not just want to take care of just their members. So they really had a large presence in the city and surrounding. And benevolent societies are the early iteration of insurance, right? Insurance policies. So folks are pooling their money together, their nickels, dimes, what have you, to make sure that when a member of this group dies, that they will have a proper burial. So I think that's very important to think about. So then when it shifts, in the 3rd and 4th phase, it's Sharp Street Cemetery. And you see them buying 8 acres of land where it is now in Cherry Hill. And you see in the records by 1903, the trustees say now we're going to name it Mount Auburn Cemetery. And that's where you have the Lawn Park Cemetery, this Black communal uplift. And here is an ad where, I'm gonna read this, because I'm not sure you can see that. Located on an elevation overlooking the Patapsco River, is now undergoing extensive improvements, which when completed will make it one of the most beautiful cemeteries in the state that our people have access for. So that's very important. This is not trying, and I mean, there's an argument for integration and there's an argument not for. But this is absolutely part of the Reconstruction era. where there's hope, there's promise, and this is something that we're gonna make sure that our Black folks are taken care of and really will rest in peace. And I think this ad was constantly out. It's very important to think about that, okay? During this third and fourth phase, the undertakers just pop out in the record. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this. So again, during this kind of Reconstruction era and post-Reconstruction era, or the turn of the 20th century, Black folks are absolutely using death work to go from the agrarian labor to the cash economy, right? You don't need that much capital. I'm seeing them pull their skill set together. I'm seeing them use skills that they learned on the plantation, carpentry skills and the like, and you have the cultural skills to make sure that you are giving your loved ones a proper burial. And that's still a conversation today. Folks don't realize that funeral homes are still very segregated today. And I can definitely, we talk about that, have questions about that, and what's going on with the $1 billion, is it SCI? Yeah, I think it's SCI. Sometimes I get it mixed up with the TV show. CSI, I guess that, but SCI and what's going on there. Real interesting thing. So you see this, Booker T. Washington, he was all over this. He loved it. Praised the funeral, praised the funeral directors, but he couldn't see the Black women, which were all up and through here, and I have a slide on that in just a second. You know, as Dr. Jackson said, if you are doing a project and there's no Black people, find them. If you're doing a project and there are no women, find them. They're there. And it took me 2 seconds to find the Black women, which have a very unique relationship to death work than white women. You have to understand this is the progressive era. You have to understand that these are race women. They are scholars, they are educated, Spelman of the like, and their community actually sees them as leaders. But this is also a funeral home. So this does not conflict with gender ideology. I'm writing on this, I have an article coming out, fascinating work here. The death work was a vehicle to challenge, resist, shatter gender roles, specialize apprentice knowledge. Like I said, Black women fit within this independent way of leveling the playing field, but also this entrepreneurial spirit. So we can talk about that. Bosses. they were. And one of the things I just have to point out really quickly is one of the ways to read this, the honorific Mrs. And is one way to read this and say they are being, they're disappearing in their husband's name, right? But during this time period, women were in defense of themselves, right? Black women were in defense of themselves, right? At a time period where it was really a public health hazard for black women were being raped at that rate. It was normalized, right? We talked about this. So to say, I am a respected married woman and you will call me Mrs., there's power in that for Black women. They advertise themselves as that. So we'll leave that there. So coming full circle, African American burial grounds creating vehicles for social justice. We could also read that gold casket that George Floyd was buried in. Definitely a statement. White society tried to say he was a thug, on drugs. Black folks said, He was very important in our community. I was hearing stories about him, winning a football championship or something. He was beloved by everyone, and we will absolutely bury him that way. And then thinking about this, say their name. We cannot just be silent. If we only know the name, if we only know the first name, that's fine. We have to start there. We have to make sure that folks understand that. So the burial ground remembers when we forget. And this really came out of my thinking about the work that I'm doing with John Dickinson Plantation, and work that I've done with Mount Harmon Plantation in Cecil County, Maryland. In Mount Harmon, this is a place where folks are still getting married on this plantation. This is a place where that's their bread and butter, 5K runs, bird watching. And there is, all of a sudden, we know at least one person who's enslaved that's buried there. But yet, when I was brought on board to do this work and start, looking at, well, there's a runaway slave ad here, this person is indentured, one of the oldest slaveholders, his inventory lists 30 folks who were enslaved, and they use the term suckling infant. So that meant, someone that's nursing. This is not a one-off. This is generational slavery that's happening on this plantation. And yet, there's a comfortable story about Stephen, who was there, who chose to, I put in quotes, who chose to stay there after slavery was abolished. So that's what I'm in my mind that I'm thinking about when I say, you can push the narrative and revise it how you want, but the burial ground is going to remember that. So this death material culture serves as a cultural institution and discursive space that mirrors the unseen. Public memory, an important claim to public space in the face of denial. There's a lot of denial that's going on here. Letting the bones speak. There's conversation. I know you in this room are going to figure out, are you going to do GPR? Do you go beyond GPR and do some of the forensic work that has been shared here with us? Hopefully you're seeing the power in that. Sometimes that's all that we have left, is to let the bones speak. That really centers this African lived experience and existence. And the burying ground really centers this experience, right? Of learning about a life that does not start with the slaveholder. I think all of you should be asking yourselves, well, who really owns this burying ground? Is it the white folks that have the paper? Or is it the black folks that are actually interred there? I'm trying to figure it out. White supremacy will have you believing something else. So I think, these ideas of ownership. And learning about a non-Eurocentric story, again, that starts with African cultural norms, beliefs, heritage, and ancestry. That's tough work. It's very hard work. And this is why my nonprofit and other things that I started early about is you will be in spaces, multiracial spaces, and folks feel like death is the great equalizer, that's the commonality, and they learn very quickly that it's not. And so you have to do some work on your own if you are a racialized white person coming to this work. It's tough work. It's not easy, but it's very rewarding. This is the John Dickinson Plantation that I'll be completing my tenure on that this year. At the bottom is the newly unearthed burying ground. Gloria Henry, the site coordinator that's been out there 30 years, says she's been looking for that moment. Right, an African-American woman, and just thinking about her relationship to this burying ground. And then at the top is the Dickinson home. So these burial spaces help to assert the African-American experience as foundational to understanding American history. That's the shift. You cannot understand this history and who we are without understanding this experience. It gives us a much more comprehensive American freedom story, right? We have this idea of pilgrims coming from somewhere and religious freedom, but their religious freedom cost Africans their freedom. And we don't talk about this story. Or the genocide that was committed to indigenous folks. We don't talk about that story, but we have to if we really want to understand who we are. They absolutely disrupt plantation narratives. Absolutely disrupt these plantation narratives. Now, John Dickinson, if you don't know anything about him, He is what's considered a founding father. He did not sign the Declaration of Independence, but his letters from a farmer really ideologically helped shape the American Revolution, right? He was much more of a, let's kind of get along. Again, didn't really want to, break away from England, right? But his democracy, in the fact that he still held people enslaved, we have to really think about, these spaces. And there really is a fascination with these old colonial families. I don't have to tell y'all in Virginia. Like we do with the English, the Queen, and when the Queen died, I happened to be at a death conference of all conferences when she died. It was a trip. You can't make this stuff up. And people coming out really talking about what that meant to be in the Commonwealth. What is that? That violence that is happening there. But we have this fascination with this, and I challenge my students. I try to go to these plantation and plan trips where we're incognito, but 30 folks show, they know what we're up to. But I tell them we're not gonna be welcome through the front door. Yes, you're white, but you don't have enough money for it. You are not gonna be welcome, right? But we have this fascination, and we don't really tell the story of how, if it wasn't for the folks that this man enslaved, or these people enslaved, he would not be able to be a lawyer, which is what he did. He would not be able to build all this wealth and all this influence and know-how. And I think what we continue to talk about today is that African American burial spaces reflecting national memory and national origin story and national identity counters social erasure. And that is just key. And it counters this segregated knowledge and this idea of benevolent slavery. That you can have a kind slaveholder. You cannot, but people really do believe that. Slavery apologists, what folks in my field, call cognac, right? Folks all the time. And I think it's important to just, who's controlling the knowledge and what's going on here. All right, so just a couple more slides to kind of round out as we're thinking about this. Again, this is actually the burying ground at John Dickinson. Here, and this is the burying ground of enslaved folks at Mount Harmon in Cecil County. They've cleaned some of this up since I was working with them. But this is about restorative justice, where you are getting justice for the wrongs of the past while holding folks accountable today, which is different from reconciliation. Reconciliation is this idea of, oh, you wronged me, I wronged you, let's apologize and let's get together. No, we have to be honest about who did the wrongdoing and what that really looks like, which is why it allows us to confront slavery, grapple with erasure, and acknowledge the legacy of slavery that we are all living in now, which is a social justice issue. This is white privilege. By virtue of slavery and the white supremacist norms that were set up in this country, if you are racialized white, you have privilege. I don't care how nice you are, I don't care how kind you are, I don't care how much money you donate to someplace in Africa, you probably don't even know where it is, you still have white privilege. And whiteness. Whiteness centers itself. We heard about that in very normalized ways that it others anyone who is not white. And this systemic racism. It forces us to grapple with this. From the education system, medical, all of these systems, on and on and on. It really forces us to think about that, right? Cultural racism is to say, because black people are dressed this way, because they talk this way, because they act this way, this is why they have not gotten ahead. That's cultural racism. This systemic racism says that it is built in our laws and our policies, right? So I think my last slide here is that reclaiming African American burial grounds are reparations I wholeheartedly believe that. Dr. Jackson and I are part of the African American Cemetery Coalition. I encourage you to check them out. Started by Deborah Gonzalez out of North Carolina. They're working with, she created the Friends of Deer Cemetery. They have an amazing in plain sight project. And this is just kind of a blog that they've written about this. But this is about reclaiming land. It is absolutely a fight. I was in Williamsburg, and there's a wonderful project that's going on with the descendant community. Their burial ground is on a naval CIA base, right? How do you get access to that? But they're absolutely, absolutely fighting it. So, thank you so much for your time. I know you're tired.